If we could only realize that we live in a world crowded with fairies, angels, and all manner of beings, it would make an immense difference in our attitude and our mode of living. The mere belief that such a world exists should delight us. The knowledge and certainty would follow in due course. We ourselves would become much more alive, for it is impossible to get in touch with that world, which thrills with the sense of being alive, without ourselves catching the same spirit and our own creative energies being awakened.
That was a quote by Dora Van Gelder, writer of The Real World of Fairies, a first-hand account of her lifelong experiences as a clairvoyant.
In this short documentary, we explore the loss of fairy faith in the Western mind and how this affects our relationship with the world.
We assert that fairy faith holds an important environmental function in the human psyche.
Fairy faith defies the objectification of the world which the modern mind is taught from a young age.
We argue that it's this very type of materialistic thinking which has led to human alienation from the natural world, and therefore our extractionist tendencies.
We believe the fairy faith is a way to re-enchant the world with joy, wonder, and life, and break down dangerous dichotomies embedded in a Newtonian mechanistic perspective. We are not here to prove fairies are real, but to discuss the very real phenomenon of fairy belief, sight, and direct experience, backed up by first-hand accounts. Our interest in the fairy faith stems from our personal ancestral Celtic traditions. Fairy faith, however, is part of a larger, universal trend of world animism. Many societies the world over have a traditional belief in a spiritual realm corresponding with their culture and landscape.
Fairy faith is relevant to the Western environmental movement because it is a belief that defies dualistic thinking. What do we mean by this? Dualistic thinking is the division of something conceptually into two opposed or contrasted aspects. For example, the division of the physical from the spiritual, nature from culture, the real from the imaginary, the subjective realm from the objective realm, the female aspect from the male aspect.
The problem with dualities is how they isolate and separate.
The Western mind, guided by a faith in scientific objectivity, often falls prey to dualistic thinking.
In this model, the intellectual and the emotional body are mutually exclusive.
We're taught from the get-go that matter is inherently objective, and therefore the world is an inanimate plane made up of objects.
Humans alone possess self-awareness and creative imagination in an otherwise mechanical world.
In this worldview, God or spirit becomes a transcendental figure. David Abram describes this in the following quote: "When the animate powers that surround us are suddenly construed as having less significance than ourselves, when the generative earth is abruptly defined as a determinate object, devoid of its own sensations and feelings, then the sense of a wild and multiplicitous otherness, in relation to which human existence has always oriented itself, must migrate, either into a supersensory heaven beyond the natural world, or else into the human skull itself, the only allowable refuge in this world for what is ineffable and unfathomable."
As a result of this duality, the Western environmental movement supports the notion that humans alone possess intelligence to manage environments. Wilderness, in this model, is out there, completely separate from the human experience. Forests are understood as being devoid of their own consciousness. Magnificent mountain vistas are only stunning because individuals judge them to be so. Enchantment is non-existent, save for in storybooks. Everything is classified as how it relates to human use. Because of this, not all landscapes are worthy of respect and preservation. We set aside small islands of protected areas judged to hold some special beauty or significance to humans, while allowing others to be destroyed.
This view is isolating and inherently incorrect. As humans, we don't live in a vacuum. We are interconnected to these landscapes and surrounded with energies. Fairy belief acknowledges this. It's like recognizing day and night are tied together by the twilight zones, where one blends seamlessly into the other. Fairies exist in these in-between spaces, in between the physical and the spiritual realms, the objective and the subjective. It turns duality into a spectrum, much like gender politics. Through this way of thinking, we can access the spiritual nature of the world, embedded and using our own bodies. This still may sound crazy,
but hear us out. Please. First off, we need to explain who fairies actually are. This is a massive list of characters, spirits, and beings, all deeply interconnected with the life forces of the landscape. According to Dora Van Gelder, the typical fairy is about 2 feet 6 inches, is made of semi-transparent energy rather than matter, and is emotional rather than intellectually based. Most don't actually have wings, but do float from place to place. The modern perception we have of fairies is informed mostly by Disney portrayals rather than traditional descriptions. Traditionally, fairies vaguely take on the characteristics and clothing of the people sharing the landscape with them.
Hi, my name is Neil, and I believe in fairies. I don't think I believe in fairies like Tinkerbell, I don't believe in them in that sense, but I feel like if I were to believe in like a fairy, it'd be more like the being and the energy of a fairy. My immediate association with them would be with something that's natural.
Fairies exist in the landscape, suspended between spirituality and physicality, and so it can be argued that the fairy faith is a form of deep ecology. Deep ecology sees the world not as a collection of isolated objects, but as a network of phenomena that are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent.
The idea of believing in fairies may seem a bit absurd to the modern mind, but people physically see the world differently depending on their belief systems. As Jeremy Hayward said, what we can and cannot perceive depends to a surprisingly large extent on what we believe, on our vision of our world and what it is made of. All right, we're rolling.
I grew up in Holland, and part of the cultural folklore is this imaginal world interwoven with the ordinary awareness that we have of the world around us, that is ever present. And there's always a sense of mystery about that. It's that it is that in-between world that seems to be present. So I remember as a child playing with that kind of world, in the sense of imagining myself into that world. We have such things as kabouters in Dutch that sit on mushrooms in the forest and who are present in that world. And I remember as a child wanting to see that and be present into it and really believing it to be present. Yeah. I think it does. It's like I feel drawn into the magicalness of the natural world. Like using a different part of our awareness, not the analytical, cognitive part of our seeing and our thinking. When you can walk through the Infinity Garden here, trying to identify the various plants that are there and figuring out how they fit in with the larger landscape and how they relate to us and so forth. That's one way of looking at it, through a cognitive and rational way of looking at the world. But you can also enter into awareness of the garden from a different space within ourselves. So what we did in the Earth meditation yesterday is we first started in the chapel. We did a meditation there that allowed us to get into this subtle realm of consciousness, which is often what happens when we do meditations, take us from ordinary consciousness into spiritual or subtle or imaginal consciousness. And then we actually perceive and see the world through that part of our awareness. through that perceptual field.
There is more to this world than what we see. Just like turning a corner and newly seeing a view that had been completely obscured before. Fairy faith is like this. Rather than a scientific truth, fairy faith is a form of knowing, feeling, and experiencing that cannot be reasoned or explained, proven or quantified by science. Therefore, this faith has been relegated to the not real, to the imaginary. We want to propose that fairies may be an emergent phenomenon arising from the experience of relationships in the landscape.
The study of phenomenology is the study of direct experience. It is useful when considering conflicting worldviews because it brings into question the assumption of an objective reality. Created by the philosopher Edmund Husserl, this discipline, unlike the mathematics-based sciences, phenomenology would see not to explain the world, but to describe as closely as possible the way the world makes itself evident to awareness, the way things first arise in our direct sensorial experience.
And then so we set ourselves up in that practice, and then we went outside with that same kind of awareness and connected in with nature, with that from that level of awareness. And I swear, you see things in a different way. You see the magicalness of nature. You see the aliveness, the luminosity of the beings that are right there in the garden. See the world in this way, and there's a deep connection that takes place. But it is all about how we see things, how we use our perceptual apparatus, and not just the eyes or the sensations, but also our inner response to what happens with the things that we see and that we imagine. I believe in fairies.
Many individuals, especially young children, recount lived interactions with fairies. Dora Van Gelder, for example, had lived fairy experiences throughout her life. She was born in 1904 with clairvoyant capabilities. She traveled the world, India, Java, and North America, documenting her experiences and conversations with beings in the spirit realm. She could physically see these beings, but describes that visibility as the result of emotional openness with that realm.
In the following passage, she describes the tree spirits of Vancouver, British Columbia. On the Pacific Highway near Vancouver, there is a magnificent stand of first-growth timber. When I first went past it, this was one of the most beautiful forests I had ever seen, rich with fairies and a sense of tremendous happiness. But once I passed it again, I experienced a sense of deep horror because half of those magnificent trees had been cut down, and where there was once beauty, ugliness and barrenness reigned. The feeling of the few trees that remained was one of expectant terror, looking hopelessly on and waiting to be cut down. For we must remember that trees cannot run away.
I guess a lack of connection to like that fairy energy, to like that mystical energy, would just cause people to be really naive and self-centered in terms of their own impact on the natural environment through their everyday activities. Because I feel like when you establish that connection to the natural world and you like can just sit here and appreciate like the abundance that surrounds you, you are less likely to damage it. Come from an appreciation of the natural world, which you can really tap into through recognizing like the energy. We're at this place now where I feel like we're like, oh, like oops.
Yeah.
We should be taking care of our environment because like our environment will take care of us if we take care of it. So
Not only did Dora Van Gelder have experiences with fairies of all sorts, she explains how fairies experience the world from their own subjective positions. Fairies have incessant activity amongst plants, shrubs, and other growing things. She explains that fairies don't see things the same way we do. We see the form of stems, leaves, and flowers, but to a fairy, every plant is a glowing object, not as something reflecting light, but actually the source of a phosphorescent-like light of its own creation. There is a constant flow from the heart center of every flower. The plant is an interface of energy exchange, and fairies see the dynamic flow of energy as light. In this way, there are no boundaries. Nothing is static.
In the Celtic ways of thinking,
Okay.
there is this idea of thin places. Thin places where we connect in to this other realm of being that we are normally kind of excluded from.
Okay.
And it's the realm of spirit, of the aliveness of plants and nature and animals and trees, and also our interaction with that world through our stories, our capacity of being able to perceive and be present to this luminous world, this imaginal world, or these thin places that allow us to generate a way of relating to that world from a new story.
Okay.
And the stories of fairies and the forest creatures and so forth are very practical ways that we as humans explore this luminous realm through story. And the stories would illuminate how we are to live with one another, with coming out of this deep respect for these other beings. There is no doubt in my mind that once you've perceived in this way, once you've seen the fairies, once you've seen the luminous creatures and see their deep intelligence that is embedded with every being in the garden, then you will see it differently every time, expecting it, seeing the possibility that it can arise.
Fairies live in this feeling dynamic place. As humans, we need to spend more time in this realm of intersubjectivity. In this intermediate realm, human imagination meets the heart and imagination of the world. Fairies are an emergent property of direct human experience with the landscape. A landscape that is sentient, feeling, and dynamic. The trees are living, breathing personalities. Everything is living, breathing, shifting, and ever-changing. Fairies are a way to re-enchant the world in this time of environmental crisis. Our current estrangement from the living earth has resulted in a time of grief, greed, and disconnection, and so it's easy to become disheartened. Fairy faith can offer us wisdom and balm for our disheartened environmental woes.
Fairies are just about like balance and like love and compassion. So I feel like when people forget about those things, that's when the disconnection happens. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Oh, did you read like our thesis statement? Testing. Fairies, we're here to talk to you
About fairies. An otherwise mechanistical world. I'm gonna say that again.
Mechanistical. Sure, try it
I'm gonna
again.
say it again. Okay.
The idea.
I'm sorry. Okay.
This may seem absurd to you, but it's not. This is science.